way. So the first assumption that we make in our theory of change is that science is a reflection of systems of power that privileges a dominant way of knowing. So there's a lot in there. So I'm going to dissect that one into two bits here. And that's first that science is a reflection of systems of power. So in that sense, what we have to start thinking about is science not so much as something opaque, but more as an institution in and of itself that embodies these systems of power. And one dimension of that could be, one such system of power is publishing, because whenever we want to improve on any of the issues that we see in research, we have to go through the ever more consolidated publishing space. So here in this graph, this is from a research paper by Lariviere and co-authors. Here they share some data on how the 5 biggest publishers in various fields, how many papers they publish proportionally over the years. And we see that since the 1970s, they've increasingly taken up more and more of that market share. So that means that 5 publishers control between sort of 60 to 70% of all the publications nowadays. I don't know whether they've updated this graph recently, but we see that the number is quite high. So there's a few corporate players who control the majority of the publishing space. And that's, for example, one system of power. So, what I've experienced is, I might change how I do research. I do all these extra things to increase the reproducibility, but then ultimately I end up in the publication stage, and all of that sort of just goes not into the trash can, but nobody sees it because, I can't change how I publish. So that's one form of power that we can think about within science. But this is only one, and there's a lot of different systems of power that intersect also. So one of those things is misogyny, and misogyny is the policing of sexism in that sense, as the philosopher Kate Mann explains it. So one of the things that also is a system of power in science is exactly this aspect of misogyny. So here's an example of a recent paper where they say that gender inequalities are observed among authors who make equal contributions, such that female authors don't receive proper credit for publications. So this is another power system within science that advantages men and disadvantages women. So this is one lens with the systems of power to also view some of the issues in research specifically. Another aspect of power can be queer and transphobia. So a recent study also indicated that we also know that for research careers to be successful, we need to publish, and it appears that when queer people or transgender people are not out in their lab, they haven't outed themselves as being queer or trans, that they actually end up being less productive in their research. So that means that if there is an unsafe space, if you're in an unsafe lab, you will not out yourself in that sense. You will not share who your true identity, and that is going to affect your career chances. So this again is a system of power. And then I can go on, but one final example I do want to give, and this is not at all a rank ordering of the importance of some of these issues. This is simply a few examples. But another one is white supremacy. So the Royal Society of Chemistry in the UK did a very good study trying to figure out how diverse, how white, in essence, the chemistry departments in the UK are. And apparently there's 0% Black chemistry professors, and only less than 1% of the PIs is Black. And then when one of the Black people is in a position of a PI, then they also get less funding. So they are set up in a space to be less successful in research. So in that sense, that is one perspective on science. Is not just that it's an issue of reproducibility, it's not just an issue of access, but it's really an issue and a reflection of the systems of power. And as a result of these systems of power, the dominant way of knowing is white, cis, non-disabled, man, and Western point of view in the world. And this is, of course, nothing new, but it's a very meaningful and helpful lens to approach how to improve research. And that's important because it helps us understand our actions as we try to do so in a meaningful manner as well. So, for example, it raises questions about whether we are creating new and dominant, powerful ways of knowing, such as, for example, elevating pre-registered research over unregistered work, or that we are creating space for various non-dominating forms of knowing to coexist, so that pre-registered research can exist, and in areas where that doesn't really make sense, that is also allowed to exist, but that it's not disqualified because it's not the dominant way of knowing. Because ultimately, if the systems of power from which these new ways of knowing originate, they're likely to be dominant, and it also means they won't work for everyone because not everyone is included in the process of creating these new ways of knowing. So that in and of itself would be a system of power, and we end up perpetuating it instead of actually restructuring it, restructuring these power systems, which is a lot to bear into one assumption, but it already just to indicate that the theory of change, the way we look at these issues, is incredibly important for how we perceive these issues and how we perceive potential avenues for improvement as well. Which leads me to the second assumption for our theory of change, which is that research is the process of documenting information. So this, in and of itself, doesn't really sound all that controversial. Assumptions tend to be very broad, but if we take this assumption further, we immediately start understanding some of the issues in science also. So if we think about 100 studies being done, we ultimately only see a subset of the work in the literature, which means that the process of documenting information in that sense has not been successful in research. So publication bias in and of itself would then be a violation of the fundamental principle of research. So we see that the process of documenting information is not lived up to if we have publication bias in the literature. Now, maybe some people will say, well, it's not a publication bias, it's for good reason, the work wasn't of high quality, so this is just a natural selection principle within science that is required, and it's not a violation of this assumption that research is the process of documenting information. So I can go along with that for now. I disagree, but for sake of the argument, we could then subsequently zoom in on one of these papers specifically. So we could say, okay, this paper, or a paper in that sense, documents the process of information or process of documenting information. But then we get this issue that we've learned over the past decade and we've known before, but has really been hammered home, is that when we have a paper, we don't see the information being documented in such a way that we actually know whether a standard scientific cycle might have been conducted, or whether it means that maybe something else happened. So the process of documenting information is limited to a degree with which we cannot understand what the actual origin of this finding is. And ultimately, we only see the paper. So the process of documenting information, even within a paper, is insufficient. And if you've ever published a paper or ever read or tried to replicate one, you probably feel the same way, that there's always a lot of invisible, undocumented work that is still present somewhere. So the second assumption being, research is the process of documenting information. And then the final assumption being really that our understanding can only be as good as the process itself. So if we have a bad process, if we have that well documented, then it doesn't mean we can all of a sudden have good understanding. So replicating a bad study, can still provide some information, but it doesn't all of a sudden make for good understanding. And it's the same here. If we don't document the process well, we also can't get good understanding, so that a good process documentation can create good understanding as well. So this is the final assumption. So if we go back to the paper once more, then that's always the end result of a research project. So in essence, if we assume research is the process of documenting information, and in order to get a better understanding, we need to have the process well documented, then the article is limited. And over the past years, we've seen a lot of artifacts being introduced into the publishing lifecycle to sort of start documenting the process better. So we've seen pre-registration, we've seen, for example, people publishing data before the paper gets published. But this still provides a limited understanding of the process, because these are just disconnected, decontextualized bits of information, and they don't actually document the process. So when we start linking these up, these bits and pieces of information, so that we can start tracing the path, then we can potentially start understanding much better, because the process of documenting information is embedded in how we publish, and then subsequently our understanding can also start growing. So for Research Equals, this is really the core principle, where it's informed by this idea of, okay, science is a system of power, and and various dominant ways of knowing can arise from it, but that we need to allow for flexibility to also ensure that people document the information, document the process, so that we can grow our understanding. And in that sense, Research Equals is really an aspirational name also, because it's not just about different forms of output being equal, but it's also that the different ways of knowing being equal. So we might start out a study with some theory. We might publish that on Research Equals or elsewhere, and then we can link that up and start tracing sort of the research journey to, for example, the pre-registration where the hypotheses are in, and then we might go down the journey a bit further and end up in the situation where, for example, somebody publishes their materials, which end up being very hard to publish in the current space, because ultimately it's the publishers who control that. And then we can continue along that path and say, maybe then we use those materials, we've collected data, and the data then is a publication. And we could continue down that path more and more, and ultimately we could still publish a paper, but instead of it being either a disconnected set of artifacts or just the outcome of the whole research process, then we have the full process documented, and we can really understand where findings come from and improve our understanding overall, and also assess whether the process actually allows for good understanding. So one example here on this slide is the actual sort of map of connections that is on Research Equals today. So we actually see that people are starting to connect up different bits of research over time, and this allows you to get more insight into how your research develops, but you can also see in real time the work of others developing, and you can build on it. So one of the things I really like is reviewing registered reports, because it can still contribute to people's work. And here we try to take that even a step further and say, well, if somebody publishes their design, you can still contribute. You might revise some of the materials, and subsequently, they might incorporate it, and you become a collaborator. So the goal of Research Equals is really to sort of break down how often we publish and give researchers the agency to publish what they want when they want it. So also, it doesn't need to be text. It can be data, code, video, presentations, grant proposals. You pretty much name it. We have it. And if not, we are always happy to add these things. And Research Equals is a scholar-led project. So we have a lot of people involved in the project. We just recently onboarded our new maintainer, Nami Tsunami, and we are continuously looking also to further improve the platform to be helpful and successful for your work. So come join the contributor community to also further develop Research Equals. We started out on the journey last February. We're doing quite well. We've hit some milestones that took us 18 months before with our previous iteration, and now we hit those in 6 weeks. So we're a scholar-led open science project and 100% independent. And recently we also became self-sustaining. So we'll be around for at least quite some while longer. And today I would really encourage you in this call to action also to either join Research Equals and publish how you know things starting today, and or stay in touch, because as I said, we are a researcher-focused project and we're at the start of this journey, and we really dynamically evolve in that sense through the input that we get. So we try to reach out as much as we can, but we also value when people send us input, because we actively decide, okay, what do we prioritize in our next feature release? What are things that can be improved? And really taking also that distance from, if you want to change something at a publisher or at a journal, it might take a few years. And we want to shrink that to being just maybe a few months. So if you have struggles or improvements that you want to see, we are more than happy to work on those. You can stay in touch through our GitHub discussions where we discuss feature improvements, or join our Discord, or you can even email me directly if you want to. And I hope that this lens of looking at trying to change research through these systems of power, looking at it through systems of power and dominant ways of knowing, that research is the process of documenting information, and that our understanding can only be as good as that process is documented. I hope that that might help you in your efforts to improve and build sustainable science. And if you feel encouraged by that, yeah, as I said, please do feel free to join Research Equals or stay in touch. And a big thank you to Sam and the Riot Science Club to inviting me here. I've been following the talks for quite a while now, so I'm very happy and humbled to be here.